Welcome to Grace Gospel Fellowship Sunday morning Bible study. I'm John Kirkwood, and this is the church where we as people seek to honor in God we trust, and we do so this morning by opening with a reading from Isaiah 26. Adonai, you are my God. I will exalt you. I hope that's 25, but that's good too. In that day, this song will be sung in the land of Judah. We have a strong city. He appoints salvation as its walls and ramparts. Open the gates. Let the righteous nation enter, one that keeps faith. You keep in perfect peace one whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you. Trust in Adonai forever, for the Lord Adonai is a rock of ages. For he humbles those dwelling on high, leveling the lofty city, leveling it to the ground, bringing it down to the dust. Feet will trample it down, feet of the afflicted, the footsteps of the poor. The way of the righteous is straight. Upright one, you make smooth the path of the righteous. Yes, in the way of your judgments, Adonai, we have waited for you. Your name and your remembrance is the desire of our soul. My soul longs for you at night. Yes, my spirit within me seeks you. For when your judgments are in the earth, the inhabitants of the world learn righteousness. Though grace is shown to the wicked, he does not learn righteousness. Even in a land of uprightness, he will act wrongly, not perceiving the majesty of Adonai. Adonai, your hand is lifted up, yet they do not see it. They will see your zeal for the people and be put to shame. Yes, fire will devour your enemies. Adonai, you will establish shalom for us, for all our works you have done for us. Okay, that is a good foundation for this morning's continuation with the doctrine of the peace of God. Today we call it a firm foundation. And I'd like to start with a quote I saw this morning. Not that one. A quote I saw this morning from a gentleman who runs one of the largest apologetics resource companies in America. And names are not important because I'm going to be critical of it. But he put up a post this morning that said, the Christian faith is different than every other faith. It's the only faith in which you take a leap into the light and not a leap into the darkness. Try it and see. The Christian faith is unlike any other faith. It is the only faith where you take a leap into the light and not into the darkness. Try it and see. This was a short little thing he put up, and I was thinking about how unfortunate that is. And I was thinking about how many Christians would shake their head and share that. Because sometimes when we're wearing the team jersey, we don't put much thought into anything. And it's just something one of our guys says, and so we're going to put it up on the wall, or we're going to raise it up the flagpole and salute it. And we don't think beyond really what that implies. Now, right now you're thinking, am I a heretic or am I an atheist, and am I picking on the Christian faith? No, no, and yes. No, no, and yes. Did you get that right? I think it'll come to full fruition when I share with you some things that happened to me this week. But we are never called to defend or to promote the Christian faith. And apologetics is not a defense of the Christian faith. Why is that a really lousy place to start or to point to, or to make it a focal point of a discussion? Well, let me start with a story that happened to me earlier this week and see if I could bring these two stories together. Earlier this week, I was in a discussion of a book that's coming out about the exploding the myths of the argument between faith and religion. I'm sorry, between science and faith. And there's a professor who wrote a book, and he's going to expose this false argument that science and faith have ever been at war. And, you know, I have to say right off the bat, I agree with that point. I don't think science and faith are at war. They can't be. They can't be, because God is the author of both. And all truth is God's truth. But I would argue that scientism and ignorant faith are at war. And that war was started at a particular point in time. And you might be surprised at who drew first blood. And I'm going to talk to you about that in a moment. But I think scientism and faith, or ignorant faith, I would say, what passes as the Christian faith, have been at war. Now, about a month or two ago, I put up an informal poll on my page that asked the question, when did the breach between science and faith first occur? Was it Copernicus, Galileo, or was it Darwin's Origin of Species? They're about 300 years apart, roughly, right? And I think the poll was pretty much split evenly. I can't remember. I think Darwin edged out Copernicus and Galileo. And I think I've talked to you about this before on a previous Sunday. And the only way that could truly happen is if somebody doesn't know what happened in the 15th and 16th centuries, or if somebody is just so biased against Darwin and evolution that they want to blame the atheist and not take any blame for the church. Because the clear breach in faith and science happened in astronomy before it ever happened in biology. And it happened under the watch of the universal church, the professing church, the visible church, when Copernicus wrote a book suggesting, contrary to what Aristotle and Ptolemy had suggested, that the earth is not fixed, that the earth moves around the sun. This wasn't very controversial at the time. He waited to publish this book really until about a month before his death, so he didn't go through anything in his lifetime. As a matter of fact, the book was actually, at the time, dedicated to the Pope. It was promoted and even taught in Catholic schools. It was, however, firmly denounced by the Protestants, the Reformers. Calvin, not mentioning Copernicus by name, but mentioning the idea that the earth moves and is not fixed, in a couple different sermons, declared this as the doctrine of demons. Luther, in his Table Talk and elsewhere, came closer to identifying Copernicus when he said there's this astrologer, and that wasn't, by the way, at that point, that wasn't a pejorative. Astrologer and astronomer at that time were interchangeable, and he also ripped on the idea that this scientist would upheave the Bible, which clearly taught a fixed earth, right? So that brings me to this week. I'm invited into this book group to review a book where an article was posted advertising this book by a very prominent Christian Science, I'll just tell you, Discovery Institute. I have a lot of respect for a lot of guys who work at Discovery Institute. I've interviewed Stephen Meyer on my radio show. So this is not a slight at any one person there or the Institute in general, but they're promoting this book. And so I'm invited into this book group, and everyone's cheering it. The article shows a picture on it. And the picture is this beautiful view from the porch of an Italian villa, Florence, a villa in Florence. And it says, look at this stunning, beautiful view. This is where Galileo lived out his life. Does this look like persecution? This is what the article said. In other words, there was no rupture between the church and Galileo. Look at where he lived to the end of his life. And I wrote, this is revisionist history. The conversation carried over into some emails. And I said, this is revisionist history. I said, the reason he was able to it was a series of questions back and forth between me and 4 or 5 other 2 scientists, 2 professors, and a pastor. And so I wrote back. I said, you know, this is revisionist history. You know why he was able to live out his life with that view, right? Now, maybe some of you don't know, but let me give you an update. By the time Galileo's writing, right, it becomes an issue in the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church is seeing a bunch of people become Protestants, and the reformers are blaming the Catholics, saying they don't respect the Bible. With them, it's the Bible and tradition. With us, it's sola scriptura, and the Scripture says the earth is fixed. And so now the Catholic Church says, what are we going to do about this? We're going to react even harsher than Calvin and Luther did. So now they bring up Galileo in an inquisition for heresy. And he's found guilty, and he's sentenced to life in prison. But before he's allowed the opportunity to recant, his inquisitors take him and show him the instruments of torture that he might become acquainted with if he doesn't recant. He invited them to look through his telescope and see what he was writing about, and they refused. But they showed him the instruments of torture as an incentive to influence a 70-year-old arthritic man on his choice. So what does Galileo do? He recants. He recants, and now if you want a little bit of the legend, there was a myth behind it, or a legend. It's rumored to have been said that when Galileo rose from kneeling and recanting, that he whispered, "But it still moves." Now, I don't know if he did that. I like it. I don't know if he did it. But he recanted, and his sentence was reduced to house arrest for the rest of his life. But his books were burned and banned. But this modern article that's showing there was no problem between the church and Galileo shows the view from his porch under house arrest. It doesn't suggest the chill that episode sent into the scientific community. If you come up with stuff that's against what we're teaching in the church, you're in trouble. So a number of these guys are writing me on how wrong I am on suggesting this is revisionist history. And they're taking up for the church. And finally, out of frustration, I wrote, look, I see what you're trying to do. I know it's a black eye on the Christian community, Protestant and Catholic, but the church is not infallible. Her husband is. The church is not infallible. Her husband is. So in the 21st century, we still have leaders in apologetics and spiritual leaders in this country pointing to the Christian faith and not to the focal point of the Christian faith, Jesus Christ. We're never told to taste of the Christian faith. The Christian faith is fallible. To an Eastern European Jew, the Christian faith is ugly. the Christian faith has failed. It's failing today, children and other people. People have taken the name of Christ in vain, and that's grouped into the Christian faith. But when you say the Christian faith is unlike all these other faiths, we jump into the light, they jump into the darkness, that's what every other faith says too. So now we're in a competition, our religion against your religion. Our laundry detergent against your laundry detergent. And our laundry detergent makes your whites cleaner. Or maybe it's our fitness routine is better than their fitness routine. And it becomes a competition between faiths, between religions. And we don't win that competition. Whenever we get in arguments like this in a debate, people will bring up things like Galileo or the Crusades or the Salem witch trials. Or it'll be pointed out that there were a lot of good Lutheran boys wearing swastikas. Or it'll be pointed out in our time, what is the Christian faith? Which one? Which one are you going to defend? Which one out of the thousands are you going to defend? Because I grew up in an area of the country where the Christian faith said, if you don't baptize babies, you're a heretic. And you grew up in a part of the country where the Christian faith says, if you do baptize babies, you're a heretic. Or you're not a real Christian because you don't believe the earth is 6,000 years old. Or you're not a real Christian because you carry the wrong version Bible. Or you're not a real Christian because you don't behave like we do. You know, when I was growing up, it was rock and roll music and your hair couldn't touch your collar. So which Christian faith are we defending? What's going to be the focal point of what you offer a lost world? A Christian faith that is fallible, or the person of Jesus Christ, which is the focal point of the whole New Testament? And as Christ said on numerous occasions in both Testaments, throughout the volume of the scroll, it is written of me. We are not called to defend the church or the Christian faith or fellow Christians. All those things are fallible. Our apologetic is supposed to be built on a firmer foundation with Christ at the focal point. And when we are going to give an answer to a man who inquires, it is to be about the hope that is within us. Is your hope today in the church? Well, the truth is, sometimes Christians get caught up in debates. And I've been watching, and this has been depressing. Can I share something with you? My wife, when I read the Quran about a year ago, I read through the Quran again, and I made the mistake of reading it at night. It was like the last thing I read before I went to bed. And I didn't sleep well. Imagine that. And she pointed it out to me. She's like, what are you doing? Why are you reading that at the end of the night? Read it during the day. And that was it. I was going to bed with that in my head. And so lately I've been working on something about why people leave the Christian faith. So I've been studying a lot of atheists, like crazy. And I've probably listened to atheist lectures and debates hours and hours the past couple weeks. And I've been doing this for 2 years in different ways. But it is a dark cloud, right? It's really, really tough. And I listened to Sam Harris probably 12 hours this week and tried to hear his argument. And I'm pretty grounded in what his argument is. He argues against a certain type of Christianity, the caricature of Christianity, the very worst elements. But he's arguing against the Christian faith. He throws Jesus in there here and there. But on a number of occasions, I've heard him say, I really don't have any problem with Jesus. And when he gets in debates, people argue with him over the Christian faith. And you might be tempted to, too. I have in the past when I've had somebody say to me, well, the Nazis were Christians, or Adolf Hitler was a Christian. And you say, well, you know, he was more an occultist than anything else. You get in that kind of argument, ignoring the fact that the truth is, there were thousands upon thousands of Lutheran and Catholic German boys who joined the Reich, who perpetrated horrible things. And the truth is, if you want to know the truth, both atheists and Christians did horrible things to atheists, Christians, and Jews. But that wasn't following the Word of Christ, right? That was at odds with the Word of Christ. But I want to suggest something to you, and it's very important because Christians get caught up in tribalism. Somebody insults, you know, they say your wife looks fat in that dress, criticizing the church. And we get all defensive about it, right? They might even say things that are not true. Or they might only mention negative things from history or whatever, or even from right now. It's not hard to pick on the church right now. You have a Catholic priest scandal that, from what I understand, from a friend who's a priest in the city of Chicago, he said, John, the corruption in the Chicago priesthood is going to make what happened in Philadelphia and Baltimore pale. He said, I think we're the worst area in the whole country, and it's going to come out. So you have the Catholic priest scandal, round 2. You have Harvest and Willow Creek failing. You have trouble at Moody Bible Institute. It's not hard for somebody who's not a believer or for somebody who is an atheist to look at the Christian church and say, wait, try this faith? You want me to try this faith? Do you know how many kids who are going to come out of Harvest and Willow Creek because their trust and their faith in their spiritual leaders has been shattered? And they're going to walk away and say, all these people are phonies and hypocrites? There is a reason that this, what do they call it? Where's Scott when I need him? The dark web, the intellectual dark web. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. But there's a reason that the intellectual dark web is exploding and churches are failing, right? I mean, 10,000 people go out to hear Jordan Peterson speak, or to hear Jordan Peterson speak to Sam Harris. Joe Rogan has 1 million people listening to his podcast. We're losing young people, but we also know where they're going now. They're in the audience of Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, and they're listening to these people. And if you approach them and say, our laundry detergent is better than yours, they're going to, well, have a list of things to throw back in your face. And now you're in a discussion. You cannot win because we're supposed to live up to a higher standard. And when we don't, we look worse than the world. And if our apologetic is, look at the Christian faith, it's shiny, all our marriages are perfect, our children obey us. What a foolish argument. The focal point of our faith and our hope is Jesus Christ. We point to Jesus Christ in spite of our failures. It's not an infallible church. Our dress is actually soiled. We need the washing of water by the Word. We need Jesus Christ to prepare us. Now I will have the Madeleine L'Engle quote. I want to share something with you from Madeleine L'Engle. You know her, of course, as a brilliant writer. However, her latest work in Hollywood was defiled by a gaggle of cackling New Agers. But she writes in The Irrational Season, she writes this: "During my journey through life, I've moved in and out of agnosticism and even atheism as I become bewildered by what mankind has done to God. And so too often I see God in man's image rather than the other way around. But I cannot live for long in this dead-end world, but return to the more open places of my child's intuitive love of God, where I know that all creatures are the concern of the God who created the galaxies and who nevertheless notes the fall of each sparrow." What she just said there is, when I look at the church, I think maybe I'm wrong about all this. This same experience, by the way, happened to another famous author recently, and she never recovered, Anne Rice. So if you want to look at the church, you're going to see some, well, let's face it, our family has some drunk uncles in it. Right? We love them. They're brethren. We're going to, for the benefit of the doubt, assume they're brethren because that's what they profess and we can't see the human heart. But we know that people do untoward things in the name of Jesus Christ. Maybe a percentage of them aren't really saved. All right, well, the bad news is they still carry the colors of Christ into the public square, and Christ still gets the blame, or Christians do, or the Bible does. So I just bring this up to you because we're talking about the peace of God today. And oftentimes we replace God with a system. And we forget about the worship of the triune God because we've added to it, or we've elevated things to the level of the Trinity. The church is not the fourth member of the Trinity. Your system, whatever it is, dispensationalism or Calvinism or Arminianism or young earth creationism, all of these things are not the fourth person of the Trinity. And oftentimes these things become an obstacle to evangelism, to reaching the lost. And it's ultimately not the Christian faith that we are to be pointing to. Because listen, we're going to point to the beauty we see in our family, right? We're going to point to when we got it right. It's not hard to do. Let's face it, Christianity, and when I say this, Christianity has transformed the world if you look at it. There's a wonderful interview I highly recommend to you by Justin Brierley on his show Unbelievable, where he has now, my memory fails me, but he has N.T. Wright. He has N.T. Wright, and he has a secular professor of history who happens to be an atheist. And they're on the show to talk about Paul. So if you go to YouTube or something and you put in Unbelievable, N.T. Wright, Paul, it's going to pop up, all right? But when they're talking about Paul, this secular atheist historian admits that the Western world is not built on the Enlightenment. It's not built on ancient Rome or ancient Greece, but it traces its roots back to the writings of the Apostle Paul. Now, when this happens on this show, you'll see N.T. Wright almost fall out of his chair. You know N.T. Wright, former Bishop of Durham, Anglican theologian, brilliant man. But he was on there to talk about Paul because his life's work has been the Apostle Paul. He's written a number of books about Paul. And he was on to talk about the effect of Paul. And I don't know if you know how Unbelievable is set up, but normally it's two people who disagree with each other, right? You bring in an atheist, you bring in a Christian, and you let them discuss things, or you bring in two people who differ on theology and they discuss things. And so when this man says it, N.T. Wright is stunned that he is admitting that basically what he's saying is that the New Testament is the reason that we have what we have, the Western civilization, the success and the advances of Western civilization. And it's not hard. D. James Kennedy wrote a book years ago, What If Jesus Had Never Been Born? Wonderful book. And he points out that modern hospitals, modern orphanages, universities, all these things, even the birth of modern science, came from those inspired Christ followers. And the church, actually. Yeah, the church actually funded Copernicus and Galileo. And that's why so many of the founders of modern science were devout Christians. And then you had a fissure. But, so we would love to point to all the wonderful, beautiful things that has been accomplished. But we just read here in Isaiah, right, that the Lord has appointed these things for us, and even that glory goes to God, even that credit goes to God. But there have been beautiful things done. I mean, we would argue that this country, built on Judeo-Christian roots, is worth celebrating on that basis. And yet, even this country has its dark pages. It always makes me cringe when I'm in the company of fellow patriots, and they do the same thing to the country's history that some Christians do, that these Christian men were doing by whitewashing the Galileo affair, by saying, oh, look at the great view Galileo had. If a liberal did that in our children's school, we'd be having meetings about the revisionist history. But when you're in the company of certain patriots, and I hate to say this, I'm in the company of a lot of patriots that I respect that don't do this, but they whitewash everything as if the founding fathers, you know, were completely without fault or without blame. And they excuse things. I've heard people excuse slavery. Oh, it's not as bad as the movies make it. You know, there were some real good slave owners. Oh, jeez. That's a winning argument. Yeah, I'll stick with the Underground Railroad and the Christians who were abolitionists. I'm not going to defend an institution as awful as American slavery. But you'll find that. You'll find that they're trying to seek balance, and they want to fight the liberals, or they want to fight, you know, the people they oppose, and their tribe is losing this, so they're going to get up and they're going to stand up and they're going to try and say that Thomas Jefferson didn't have moral failings. Or that Ben Franklin was really all the time just flying a kite when he wasn't writing brilliant things. There was no problem with Franklin and ladies and drinks. And I love these men in spite of their flaws. But when you try to hide them, you lose a hearing with honest people. When you don't have objective honesty, people write you off and walk away. And this book, when it comes out, is going to be another black eye for Christianity, because it's going to be pointed to as, look, Christians don't even accept the fact when they were wrong. Because everyone in the world knows that it wasn't a roving band of angry Aristotelians who burned Bruno at the stake with his books under him. It wasn't a bunch of scientists who threatened Galileo. Although scientists didn't like him, they didn't threaten him with that. All right, where was I going? So L'Engle, Madeleine L'Engle, in this really confession, she writes in this confession, she says, when I look at what mankind has done to God and how they've created him in their image, I sometimes waver. Our focal point must be the person of Jesus Christ. Every other thing will disappoint. and every other thing is less than worthy of worship. There are some people who worship the church. I'm amazed, though, at how many of them are so-called Protestants. Well, let's start in Philippians today. Philippians chapter 4, of course, Paul gives a commentary on Isaiah 26, which I've just read to you. And the key verse is, of course, I will keep thee in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee. He will keep thee in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee. In the Hebrew, the word isn't perfect. There's a repetition of the word peace. It basically says, peace, peace. And it's translated perfect peace, and that's not a bad translation. That's actually a proper one. That's what you do with that. It's peace on another level. And then the next verse says, trust in Adonai. So here you have two things. You have two things. Let your confidence be in Adonai. And keep your mindset on Jesus. Notice Madeline's mindset when it goes to the church, she wavered. When Peter takes his eyes off of Christ, he sank. Well, he was in the presence of all the other apostles. He was in the presence of the church. He was in the presence of Christ. He was still sinking. And were it not for the hand of God, he would have drowned, because it was a tempest. It was a storm. All right, Philippians. Let's look at it a little bit. You remember the Isaiah verse, right? Chapter 4, another horrible chapter division because it begins with a therefore. But look, this is such a short book, I don't think I would have put chapters in it. I mean, it's four little, it's a short letter. Anyway, therefore, my brothers and sisters, Paul has just argued about our citizenship being in heaven. He argues our walk, our citizenship, and he says, therefore, my brothers and sisters, whom I love, my beloved, whom I long for, my joy and my crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way, my loved ones. All right. So first, he gives them these encouraging words of how he, their apostle, loves them. This is a gentle rebuke, folks. There were things that were going wrong in the church, but Paul knew that the people there meant well. He loved them all. He saw the disunity as a dysfunction in the church, but their disunity was different than the Corinthians and the Galatians, right? Which tells me it was not something doctrinal, and it tells me it was probably something small and petty that had blown up. Spiritual leadership in the church was sitting this one out, so Paul gently rebukes them too. But here he opens up with, you guys know I love you. This is like writing to a son at college, and you're not writing to your son named Corinth at college, who's, getting kicked out because he's got all F's because he's been drinking every day since he left home. And, it's what was a John Belushi movie, Animal House? He's not writing to that son. He's not writing to somebody whose behavior is deplorable. He's writing to somebody who is rightly motivated, but has got a few things wrong. And so he's writing with encouragement. He wants them to know that he loves them, and he loves them all. This is a very, I told you it's a very military letter, because he keeps using military metaphors. Philippi was a bunch of retired Roman legionnaires. And, but it's also a Texan letter, because he uses y'all. I think it's like 9 different times in the first chapter alone. And he's trying to bring them together. He's not going to address the different factions. Notice he doesn't say, Euodia's right on this one, Syntyche. Get your nose right on it. He doesn't take a side. And he doesn't address a specific issue like he does with Corinth about how they were going to the love feast and getting drunk. So it's not something specific like that. It's maybe a clash of personalities that has grown out of proportion. But he begins here. He says, I urge. He doesn't command. I urge. I urge Euodia and Syntyche to be in harmony in the Lord. Now, that's a tough thing to read if you're Euodia and Syntyche. If I did that here today, I'm going to say two names of people who are strong and can handle this, right? I'm going to pick on my wife. If I say Reggie and Wendy, I urge you to be in harmony with the Lord. Wow, that's suggesting that they're not. And that was just read in front of the whole church. So that hurts. That's tough. It's medicine. It's hard to swallow if you're those two women. It's also hard to swallow if you've taken up arms behind one of those two women. Yeah, you're right, Euodia. She's ridiculous. So the two factions that were causing disruption in this church are being rebuked through the two leaders of the factions. And it wasn't an easy read. Not when you get to chapter 4. Reggie, you know I love you. And of course, you know I love you, Wendy. I know you're in harmony with the Lord. Forgive me. Thank you for being an example. Euodia, I urge Euodia and Syntyche to be in harmony in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you, true companion, people think this might have been Luke, but who knows, to help these women. They labored side by side with me in spreading the good news, together with Clement also and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. Here it is. Rejoice in the Lord always. There was probably no joy in Mudville. And you know what? Disruption in the church, when you have friction in the church, it's not a very joyful thing. You know, people show up at church. I've had people tell me when they're going through something with somebody here at church, and I'm certain there's been people who haven't told me because maybe they were going through something with me. But I've had people tell me that they have no joy when they come. They walk in and they feel, you know, and that's a horrible feeling. That should not be. This should be a nest. It should be the dinner table where all the family comes together. The Blue Bloods Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon dinner or whatever. That's what this should be, right? A place of encouragement and provocation unto love and support, and people who are willing to sorrow with those who are going through sorrow and to joy with those who are going through joy. This should be a place where you yearn to come all week long. But we all know that life doesn't work always that way. And sometimes there's a bully in the flock. That's why the shepherd is given a crook and a staff, not just to protect from predators outside the flock, but to straighten out a bully in the flock. And sometimes that doesn't go well, and who knows what's going to happen, but that's what's happening here in Philippi. And Paul is bringing them back to the fundamentals. Look, our joy is in the Lord. And it's so redundant here, because he says rejoice, and again I say, right? So he makes it super redundant because it's something that they had forgotten. Rejoice in the Lord always, at every time, in every circumstance, through adversity, through prosperity, through normalcy. You know, on the whole continuum of your life as a Christian community together, he's talking to a local church. So throughout all the evolutions and revolutions of your life as an assembly, your joy is in the Lord. It's not that we didn't make the budget this year or that we laid to rest a dear departed member of the church. Our joy is in the Lord. Come what may, no matter what. And he says, again I say, rejoice. He repeats this, by the way, a number of times in some of his other letters. And one of the things I really loved, I don't know if you've all seen Paul Giamatti played John Adams. Have you seen that? It was a series, I think. HBO, was it?
No.
One of those. You could look it up. But he played John Adams, and I have to be honest with you, I'm a bigger fan of Abigail. That's why my daughter's middle name is Abigail Adams. I think Abigail was twice the patriot that John was, and I think she would have been better in office than John was. I love John Adams, but Abigail was amazing. Having said that, they sucked the faith out of that series, with one exception, with one place. John and Abigail were devout in faith. I mean, you read their letters, and it comes across convincingly. It was kind of sucked out of that series. Although it's a wonderful series, and I highly recommend it. They played Jefferson perfectly. But there's a scene toward the end of the series where John Adams old, he's elderly, and I forgot which son he's with, but the son who's living on the farm with him is walking, and they're walking through a field, and he comes upon this beautiful flower, and he points to the flower, and he tells the son, and I'm going to butch this, and I'm sorry if you've seen it and I get it wrong, but it's well worth your time. He has his cane, and he points to the flower, and he says, you know, I've seen a queen of France dressed in a gown covered with diamonds, and I've never seen something more beautiful than this flower that God has dressed right in this field. And he says, and he yells out, Paul, rejoice. And again I say rejoice. He yells this out. And then he's going to get on his knees and rejoice. And his son says, Dad, I don't think I'll be able to get you up. So he holds him up. He doesn't let him get on his knees and pray. But it's the best part of the whole miniseries. They finally got to his faith. And it's at a great point because all his life he fought with anxiety. He was a very ambitious man. And that came through with his son John Quincy, who followed in his footsteps, but he had another son who it destroyed. You know, because you can't treat your children all the same, they're different, and he didn't know that. And Abigail was a wonderful mother, but John struggled as a father. And he treated all his children the same, and it was all in a very strict fashion. And one son shined, John Quincy, and one son drank himself to death. How did I get there? Rejoice in the Lord. So it's a wonderful moment. He says, rejoice in the Lord. And here it is. Let your gentleness be known to all people. I meet a lot of Christian men, and I don't think gentleness is at the top of their ticket. You know, the very word gentleman comes from this idea that you could be a man like John Wayne, right, and still be gentle and not lose your manhood. I'm not talking about toxic masculinity or whatever the fad phrase is of the intelligentsia today. I'm talking about an actual man. And to be a gentleman meant things. It meant you live by a certain code. I hate to tell you this, but I'm going to tell you this, and it's going to challenge you. One of the reasons young people are fleeing the church and running to the intellectual dark web, if you go and watch, I think they've had 4 discussions, Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. Both these guys are unbelievers. Even though Jordan Peterson tips his hat to the Bible and to Jesus, he's an unbeliever. So both these guys are secular. One's a neuroscientist, one's a psychologist, brilliant men. If you go and watch them have their debates, third debate I watched last night, third debate opens up and they both express Thomas Aquinas. They're both asked to to express their opponent's position. And you know, Aquinas said you should never get in a discussion or an argument with anyone, and you should never start picking apart an opponent's view until you're able to express that view to them and they shake their head, yes, that's it. So you watch debate 3 with Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, and they do this. They follow the Aquinas rules. That's being a gentleman. Harris says, this is what I think you're trying to say, Jordan. Even though Jordan disagrees with him, I think you're trying to say this. And Peterson says that about Harris, and then they have a discussion for 2 hours as gentlemen. Now, I challenge you to watch that, 2 unbelievers expressing Aquinas, and then watch any debate with Ken Ham. I'm going to step on people's toes here today. Go watch Ken Ham debate any other fellow Christian on the age of the earth. Go watch Ken Ham on TBN debating Hugh Ross. Go watch Ken Ham debating, again, Hugh Ross and Walter Kaiser on John Ankerberg. Now, I could pick on other Christians. I'm picking on him because he's the one who breaks the rule of being a gentleman all the time. All the rules go out the window. He's a bare-knuckle brawler. He treats fellow Christians like dirt. And somebody's got to call out the bullies on our side. So if you're a big fan of Ken Ham, great. Go watch the 2 atheists talk, and then watch what Ken Ham does, shaking a Bible at Hugh Ross and calling him a heretic, pretty much. So the world sees this. The world sees this, and if you want to put up your Christian faith, right, against the intellectual dark web, they're going to come here every time because they see that. And they don't want any part of that. How did I get on that? I'm in big trouble today. Wendy's not even looking at me. She knows. Gentleness. So look, the Apostle Paul is saying here, rejoice. If you struggle with anxiety, folks, if you struggle with any kind of mental attitude sin. Now, I said the S word, didn't I? I know people like to think of it maybe as a disorder or other things, but ultimately, anxiety for a believer is a sin. And if that hurts your feelings, I'm sorry, I sin. I have mental attitude failures, usually with anger and prejudice, prejudgment. It's not anything to do with race. Don't take it as bigotry. But oftentimes I'll judge a book by its cover, and I have to pray about it. Well, the atheist comes into a debate, and I'm already judging him, instead of actually hearing him and listening to him and realizing that this is somebody whom God loves and God created, and he was created for his pleasure, and God desires, and I should give him a hearing, and I should look at the psychology behind his bitterness and look for an approach to treat him. But no, I have a problem with anger and prejudice. I'm telling you, in case your problem is anxiety, I'm not picking on you. But I will say this, there is a formula in Scripture for dealing with it. Isaiah says that God will keep you in perfect peace if your mind is stayed on him. That is a full-time job, especially if you have, an attention disorder, and your mind, you've got the monkey mind that jumps around on all different things, and you're hearing all these different voices at once, and you've got all these plates in the air. A lot of distraction in our world. And so keeping our mind on Christ is tough, especially if we're really into justice. There's certain personality types that are justice-oriented. By the way, Sam Harris is justice-oriented. So if you want to, the best thing I could say about that angry atheist is that he has a sincere desire to eliminate what he sees as unnecessary human misery. That's about the only good thing I could say about him right now. And I actually got that from Jordan Peterson. But they're giving me my lights already. Let me at least get through this. Rejoice in the Lord always. Let your gentleness be known to all people. How do you do that? It's not saying boast. Philippians has already excluded boasting. So how do you allow gentleness to emanate from your person so that everyone knows it without being a narcissist? You develop it as a habit. Oh, that's how I got on gentleness. Yeah. To be a gentleman, right? Here's how the Lord would have you discern, by the way. This came up on Thursday night. How do you discern if you're throwing your pearls before swine? I've met a lot of swine in the Christian church. As a matter of fact, I was in a room with 5 of them the other day. Here's how you tell if your audience is a swine and you shouldn't waste time on them. Do they answer your questions? I mean, true gentlemen try and answer each other's questions before they make their own claims. Are they actually listening to you? If you're having a discussion with them, do they actually listen to you? Or are they simply waiting for you to take a breath so they can fire off their points? A swine doesn't listen, a swine doesn't answer, and there's a lot of us in the church. All right, here it goes. Ready? Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all human understanding, will garrison your hearts, will guard your hearts and your minds in Messiah Yeshua. And he's going to show you how you can do this by what was one of my mother's favorite passages coming right now. Ready? Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any virtue and if there is anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. What you've learned, received, and heard and seen in me, put these things into practice, and the God of Shalom will be with you. Put these things into practice. So first of all, Paul is, this is nothing more than a good mechanic. This is nothing more than what a good mechanic does. This is nothing more than what a good doctor does. You go into a doctor's office, you're not feeling well, he's going to ask you a series of questions and do some preliminary things. You know, check your pulse, your weight, this and that. He's going to ask you where it hurts, how it feels, this and that. And he's going to come up with a diagnosis. Might run some tests, and he has a diagnosis, and you have this disease. And then he's going to give you a prognosis. Here's the prognosis. If you do nothing, if you go ahead with the way you're going, you're going to die. Or you're going to get diabetes. You're going to have diabetes. But he doesn't leave you there. A doctor will give you a diagnosis, a prognosis, and then he gives you a treatment plan. But here's the good news, the treatment plan. Follow this treatment plan. If you follow this treatment plan. Now, this happened recently with a dear loved one of mine. She was given a diagnosis and a prognosis that was dire, but then a treatment plan. And with the treatment plan, the odds were infinitely better than without the treatment plan. But she could have chosen not to take the treatment. Listen, I'm going to seem so negative, but you're going to see a little bit of my prejudice. I love Joey and Rory. I listen to them like crazy. I love them. But the more I found out about the story, the angrier I got. Because, you know, she died. And I think she died needlessly. She didn't do the treatment plan. And she left behind not only a husband, but a child. Now, I don't know what kind of decision-making went into that. Maybe I'm not privy to something that would have made me choose the same path. But if you don't choose the treatment plan, well, The doctor did all he can do. Christians are not guaranteed the shalom of God. Positionally, you have peace with God. That's positional. It's not something you feel. It's something in your bank account. You're not at war with God. But to know the peace of God, what is the peace of God? The capacity of a Christian to be content in any state. But in this book, I tease people when I'm asked to speak in Illinois. I usually say there's two men who have kept me here in Illinois. John Wayne and the Apostle Paul. And John Wayne has this wonderful album about America. And in it, he puts poems to song. And in it, there's this old Western song with a Spanish name. And it's about a group of cowboys who are riding through this abandoned Mexican town. And they're riding through this town, and there's nobody there, and the tumbleweed is blowing. And the things are flapping on the abandoned buildings, and all of a sudden they ride up and they see an old Mexican man on a porch. And they say, "Old man, what are you doing here? Why are you in this godforsaken town all alone? Why are you still here?" And he says, "Mis raíces están aquí." My roots are buried here. My roots are buried here. So that's one excuse to stay in Illinois. The second one comes from Philippians when Paul says, "I am content no matter what state I'm in." All right, forgive me for that one. But that's the idea. The Christian contentment means that you have a supernatural peace that emanates from you, a joy about you, a gentleness about you, whether you're in the White House, the penthouse, the outhouse, or the gulag. No matter what your circumstance, you're unflappable. The Hanoi Hilton, unflappable. Well, this is not why you become a Christian, just so you can have this perfect peace. But it is an element of being in Christ and being in harmony with Christ. In other words, if Ted played if I strike a tuning fork and it's a C, to be in harmony with that, right? You have a tuning fork too, and it starts to vibrate. So God has struck a chord. He struck a note. God has struck a note, and we are to be in harmony with that. Now, you'll notice it takes thinking. That it's a war that takes place in the mind, whose mind is set on thee. Trust in Adonai, whose mind is set on thee. Trust in Adonai. This is an aspect not only of the intellect, but of the will. That's the intellect and the will. If my intellect and my volition are squared away, I will have peace. And what does it mean? It means in my intellect, I am to contemplate Jesus Christ, God the Father, God the Holy Spirit. In truth and in beauty, everything that's commendable that I see actually in nature itself and reflected in you. That means when I look at Sam and I look at Louise, I see the commendable of Christ. First and foremost. And it makes me joy. And it makes me praise God. Right? So it's in the intellect and in the volition. Make your mind saturated with the person of Christ and what he has done and what he has accomplished. And it's victorious. And it's worthy of praise. and it'll make you shout when you see the flower in the field or the flower in the soul of a follower. But it needs to be put into practice. So God says, rejoice, be gentle, come to me in prayer without ceasing, make your requests known, but make your prayers thanksgiving. Thankful person, the thankful person, gratitude is something that helps the stability of the soul. But it's a practice. And the practice becomes a habit, and the habit practiced longer becomes a virtue. And then it becomes second nature. And you breathe in harmony with Christ. And when you hit a bump in the road, you might be distracted for a moment, but your default setting comes back to that Christian contentment and that harmony. You might be upset and angry with somebody for a while, and you go away and you pray, and then you realize they're fallible. They're everything you said they'd be, Lord. And I have an opportunity to help by either rendering forgiveness or encouragement, or maybe it's me who needs to receive the forgiveness. Maybe it's me who needs to go away and pray and realize I have failed, and you go to them and you ask them for forgiveness. And this doesn't happen in America today. And your proudest moment as a parent will be when you see this happen in your children. So what does that tell you about God the Father? All right. I've run long today, that you might have peace. We'll come back to this next week. I'm not in a rush to get through peace, are you? All right. No bill today. Okay. I guess you get announcements from me, which are going to be very simple. I think there's a business meeting on the